Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now live stream. By now, you're probably tired of being inundated with political messages, whether they're from your neighbor's yard, flyers in the mail, texts on your phone, podcasts, news alerts, and of course, the commercials that dominate the airwaves, especially if you watch college or pro football. Tonight, we're going to ask a few of our UW faculty who study public policy to assess the likely impact of the presidential candidates' stated positions on a wide range of economic policies. We're going to try to seek to understand, what are the biggest differences between the two candidates on the economic issues, and then which of those issues do they really control the policy as opposed to possibly having to cooperate with the legislative branch and get a different result. A couple of disclaimers before we get started tonight. We don't have a monopoly on the truth, but we will try to apply the tools of social science and economics to have an informed discussion on the broader impacts of policies. And we understand that the benefit of any particular policy will vary greatly depending on an individual's income, occupation, or other characteristics. One of the concerns I have as I've been watching the campaigns unfold is the extent to which our polarization combined with the razor-thin margin in the polling data has created an environment where it seems that there's a heavy focus on redistribution through policies and a lot of promises to give away money, kind of rewarding your supporters or those who are you're trying to court at the moment, and maybe punishing your opponent. So how any of you might feel about a particular policy will certainly depend very much on where you sit in the economy. There's no absolutes here on how policies will affect you at the individual level, but our panel will try to give us some insights into how they feel some of the policies will affect overall economic growth in the nation. So with that, without further ado, I'm going to bring on our guest this evening. Kim Ruhl is the Kurt and Sue Culver Professor of Economics, and he co-directs the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. His research focuses on international economics, and he's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Tim Smeeding is the Lee Rainwater Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Public Affairs and Economics in the Follett School of Public Affairs and a two-time Badger himself, a nationally renowned expert on anti-poverty policy. His recent work is focused on social and economic mobility across generations and income inequality. And Mark Copelovitch is Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs, also in the Follett School, and he directs the UW's Center for European Studies and will add his perspectives on how maybe our allies and others will feel about some of these policies and what their reactions might be. So we've got an exciting program tonight, and we're going to start out with Kim Ruhl, who's going to give us an overview of some of the economic policies and their impacts. It seems like right now we're talking a lot about the impact of inflation, but I'm also hoping we can dive a little deeper and talk about how these two different administrations, hypothetical administrations, might approach economic policy and just what that will do for growth, inequality, and maybe inflation as well. So Kim, over to you in Rochester, New York.
Great, thanks, Mike. Okay, next slide. Okay, great. So since I'm going first, I thought I would also take a moment to try to give a kind of broader framework to think through some of these things, so that when you're not listening to a bunch of talking heads and you're thinking about, as Mike said, how these things might affect yourself, the kind of a way to think about these things. So, like almost anything else, there's an unlimited demand for government, for services, for goods, for transfers. Your goods and services and transfers you want might be different than somebody else's, but there's a big demand put on governments, and governments have budget constraints. Maybe not exactly like a household has, but in a sort of similar way. And so Anytime I want to increase spending on goods or services, or want to make bigger transfers, or I want to decrease taxes, those have to be offset somehow, right? And if they're not offset today, we can also offset them in the future. We can transfer these things through deficits and debt into the future and kind of make them, in some sense, somebody else's problem. And so, next slide, please. And so that's kind of how I wanted to lay this stuff out. So we're all going to talk about different things. I thought I would talk a bit about deficits and debt. And so there's an equation there, but you don't really need to pay attention to it if you don't want. The words will do the same thing. We're going to try to measure federal government's debt relative to GDP. So you think about that kind of like a debt to income measure. I want to normalize the amount of debt by how much income the government, the country is responsible for. And so if I want to think about how much debt there's going to be next year, well, I start with how much debt I have today. I add to it interest payments. I subtract from it something about GDP growth. When the economy grows faster, that makes debt less of a problem. Just like when your income goes up, debt becomes less of a problem. And then that last term, probably the most important one, the primary balance, right? That's where the new borrowing and lending is. That's the what we're going to call we call the government deficit when that number is negative. And so policy, it affects these different terms in different ways. The primary balance, like I said, that's sort of the biggest one that kind of the government has the most control over, and that's something about how it raises tax revenue and how it spends it. Interest payments reflect typically things that we've done in the past. The governments have a lot less control over interest rates than they might like you to think. And then GDP growth. So certainly there are things governments can do to try to help GDP grow, but it's a notoriously difficult thing to do. That's why most economists think markets are the better way to organize an economy rather than a centrally planned economy, because it's pretty hard to try to do the right things to make the government grow. Next slide. So there's a picture of the U.S. debt to GDP ratio, and you see there's a big spike right after and during World War II. So that's the deficit spending that the U.S. government did, the borrowing that it did in order to build an army and fight the war. And then you see it falls after that as the debt to GDP ratio falls. And it starts to rise again in the 80s. And then there's two big jumps that kind of happen after that. The first one comes right after the financial crisis in 2008, 9, 10. That's the big stimulus package. And then the other very sharp spike, that's again the COVID stimulus happening in 2020, 21. And you can see now the debt to GDP ratio hovers somewhere around 120% of GDP. Next slide. Okay, so I just want to go through all these different pieces and talk about how the two candidates' policies might affect. I just want to start with the primary balance. That's where the real kind of fiscal policy rubber meets the road. Next slide, please. So that's what it looks like. So the red line there, that's government spending, and the black line are tax receipts, more or less. And you can see that for a big chunk of this, they're kind of moved very close to each other. Sometimes outlays are higher than receipts, sometimes others, and the balance was close to zero. Right? We did a little bit of borrowing, sometimes we did a bit of lending, savings, and then in the last 15 years or so, we sort of consistently had outlays greater than receipts, and government balance has gone more and more negative, and that's why we saw the debt to GDP ratios growing. Next slide, please. So here's a sense of, from what we can tell, these two candidates' fiscal policies sort of look like. So for Trump, you see the first bullet point is things that are going to cost money, larger outlays, and the second ones are maybe things that might add to receipts. So the biggest things here for Trump would be extending the TCJA. So that was the 2017 tax bill. A lot of that's going to expire next year. He wants to extend it and kind of make it even larger. And then some things like exempting tip income, overtime income, Social Security benefits from taxes. Those are all kind of major future outlays. And then the goal to sort of pay for these things is to increase tariffs. Right? Maybe a tariff on everything, maybe an even larger tariff on China, like 60% or something. On the Harris side, she also wants to kind of extend parts of the TCJA, but only for households making less than $400,000 a year. So a more targeted or targeting a different group. and then increasing the taxpayer credits for children, earned income taxes, and exempting tips. She would like to increase revenues by increasing corporate taxes, income taxes on high earners, and she presumably is going to continue the existing tariffs that the Biden administration has kept in place, that the Trump administration started. And so the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget thinks Trump's policy is going to add about $7.5 trillion to the debt. Harris is about $3.5 trillion. So Trump's is it's going to be larger, most likely. If they could do everything that they want to do, it would be have a larger impact. Next slide, please. So next up, interest payments. Next slide. So here's how interest looks. You can see this is interest as a share of the government budget. It has a big peak in the 1980s when interest rates are very high, and then it falls as interest rates fall. And again, it's peaking again, right? I think anybody who's been paying attention knows that interest rates have gone up a bunch. If you look to the panel on the right, you'll see that the top three things now that the US government spends money on are Social Security and Medicare. Those are big entitlements that are problematic in the sense that they're largely they're big deficits to be funded there. But then the third one is interest. So interest has gone from being not a very big part of the budget, 5% or less, to now a pretty large part of the budget at this point. Right? And so there was an idea that when interest rates were low, the government should be borrowing a lot and investing it in things. And now interest rates are high, and it's a bit of a different story. Next slide, please. And then the last one, GDP growth. So what can the government do, or what kind of policies do we see that the candidates are proposing to make the economy grow better? Next slide, please. This is a little harder because the candidates have been a little more unclear about what exactly they want to do. But my reading of their websites, Trump sees his tariffs as industrial policy that by closing off trade with the rest of or severely limiting trade with the rest of the world, that's going to lead to more growth in the U.S. We can talk about whether that's true or not, whether economists think that's sort of what would happen. They typically think that's not going to be the case. Movements towards removing green mandates to the extent that those are hindering production, and then energy policy. That's something that Trump has stressed a lot, basically going back towards a mix of fossil fuels and away from greener energies. Harris has talked about things like housing policy, so bringing down, subsidizing basically both house supply and house demand. So it's not clear how that in the end would work out for house prices. Some stuff about price gouging, drug prices, a raft of policies for small business benefits, including tax breaks and startup loans, pro-union policies, and higher minimum wages. So a mix of things that economists might say might be good for the economy and things that might slow down the economy as well. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, there's a lot out there, I guess, but when I took a step back and think, what are the big three things? The big three things I think to take away are their tax policy, tariff policy, which both the candidates seem to be interested in doing, and then entitlements. You notice you don't hear them say much about entitlements. Entitlements, meaning Social Security and Medicare, are things that people who tend to vote are getting right now. And so that's always been something nobody wants to talk about. But something will have to happen most likely in the next administration on how to deal with paying for those entitlements. And so that's coming. Tariffs are probably the one thing that the one big thing the president can do more or less by him or herself. Trump didn't need Congress to put those tariffs in place, and Biden didn't need Congress to keep them there. And so that's something where the president does have a bit of room to maneuver. And the taxes are going to involve Congress, and so that's going to come down to, I think, a lot of what the makeup of the House and Senate look like, and what kind of deals they can get done. So let me leave it there, and we'll move on. And
great, thank you, Kim. We'll come back to a little more discussion on tariffs and where you think the incidence of tariffs will really land. Will it be on foreign companies or on American consumers? That's the million-dollar question there. We're going to move next to talk about some broader social policies that could affect families across the country through things like healthcare, immigration, and labor supply. And so we're going to bring Tim Smeeding in to tell us more about what he makes of the impacts of some of the proposed policies on low and middle income families and their environment. So Tim, thanks for joining us from Salt Lake City in the Delta Lounge.
Hey, you do what you got to do to be on the show.
You know, one of the hardest working men in America.
Trying to be retired. Anyway, thanks, Kim. It was a great start. He laid out a lot of issues. I'm going to talk about domestic and social economic policy issues. And next slide. So I'm going to talk about 4 things: immigration and labor supply, healthcare, health insurance subsidies and limits to healthcare expenses, regulations, income support policies, those very entitlements that Kim pointed to, the child tax credit, the child independent care tax credit, SNAP, which is food share in Wisconsin, or food stamps, and Social Security. And then finally, the looming 2025 income tax bill, which we're going to have, and where these battles about tax increases and tax cuts and subsidies are all going to be ironed out. So I'll go right away to immigration. Immigration is a huge issue in the country. The issues, as I see them, are the volume of immigration versus the speed of processing. Finally, the volume is falling. Migrant encounters expanded greatly under President Biden. We had refugees, we've had asylum seekers, temporary protective status. We've got a lot of students who have managed to outstay their student visas and are hoping to get a work visa in the United States. And we have refugees who are guaranteed benefits who came from war-torn countries. So the volume is falling now, but we've got a big overhang, and we have to process them. Those people have to be processed. They have to have their cases adjudicated. They need lots of different things. And finally, we've got something left over from the Biden administration, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. These are kids who are born in America, who are allowed to stay here without a path to citizenship for 20-some years now. Many of them have kids now. The kids are citizens, and we haven't been able to make a decision on that either. So there's some of the issues. Next. Now, here's a few facts that are going to help determine what happens. 87% of immigrant children are born in the United States. They're a major source of U.S. population growth. They're citizens by birth. Those kids are like your kids or my kids. They have all the same rights and privileges. Their parents don't, but they do. Okay? Marriage rates among recent immigrants are higher than natives. Okay? And they have a higher birth rate, too. And they play a massive role in the economy. I'm going to show you. They created a surge in workforce, offsetting retiring baby boomers, a big one, 6 or 7 million. We want new homes constructed, right? Well, 25% of current home construction workers are immigrants. They build houses. They don't build the big buildings and the contractors as much in downtown Madison, but if you're building houses somewhere, they're building houses. Okay? Immigrant women in particular play a large role for caring for the elderly. Do we need any elder care in this country? I think so. Immigrants are key workers in many industries, hospitality services, and restaurants. We know that. Agriculture and dairy farming. Who needs dairy farmer workers? Meat processing and more. Okay. Now, that looks nice, but you have to understand that the fiscal benefits, who gets the tax revenue and so forth from these recent immigrants, are people at the federal level, because they pay payroll taxes and income taxes, and they don't use many federal benefits. But the cost of educating the kids and so forth follow state and local governments. So there may be a case for making some subsidies to places that are experiencing extremely large immigration. Next. So here are the demographic factors that contribute to population growth. You can see on the bottom, births minus deaths are negative in 12 or 13 years. In other words, more Americans are dying than are being born. What makes up the difference? Net immigration and the children of immigrants. So all of our population growth from 2039, according to the Congressional Budget Office, is coming from immigrants. Okay, next. Here's immigration surge and job growth. This is from the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank. The labor force in 2023, you can see on the right there, is larger by 5.2 million people, mostly because of higher net immigration, according to the CBO estimates. And as a result of this surge, GDP is going to be higher by 8.9 trillion, government tax revenues by 1.2 trillion, and deficits will be lower by a little less than $1 trillion. So this is all, seems to me, good economic news, okay? Next. Where are the candidates? Harris has mainly stuck to her promise to sign into law a bipartisan security deal, which was scuttled. It was agreed on by the Senate and the House, but it was scuttled by the current Republican nominee who didn't want it to be passed. So it never made it out of the Senate. It would increase judges, asylum workers, temporary facilities, and other officials to speed up determinations of asylum. And she wouldn't throw anybody out who hasn't threatened. She would not threaten deportation of anybody who's not a criminal. On the other hand, Mr. Trump has announced he will have massive deportations, up to 10 million. He wants to end birthright citizenship. He wants to deport pro-Palestinian students on visas. But he wants more green cards for foreign student grads, UW grads, who come from another country, let's say, who might be able to get a job here. Okay? Now, regardless of who's running the ship, you're going to need new work visas so that immigrants who are here can work legally. You have massive backlogs in the immigration courts, and you have to renew those individuals in temporary protective status. That's going to follow the next administration. It has to be done. I don't see mass immigration, but those are your choices. Okay, one down. Now, healthcare, health insurance, and healthcare costs. Now, use your history book a little bit. Remember, Trump tried to repeal Obamacare 25 times. The Congressional Budget Office said 23 million people would have insurance, and John McCain stood up at 1:30 in the morning and put his thumb down like that, and that was the end of that. So he tried to go back more pro-market and not use Obamacare. What he was going to substitute, no one knew, but he was just going to dump Obamacare because it was Obama. Harris, on the other hand, wanted to move to a single-payer system in 2019. That's a huge jump for the Americans to go to a single payer. I'm not saying it's good or it's bad, but it's a huge jump that would have taken so much energy and so much politics. Neither of them happened. So where we are now is they're both agreeing, I think, to continue the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion in all but 10 states. Who's the only northern state who doesn't have Medicaid expansion? Someplace called Wisconsin, which would make $1.7 billion. Have the feds pay instead of the state pay, but somehow we can't get that through our legislature. But this continues on health policy where it is now. Now, both candidates discuss offsetting the cost of prescription drugs. Harris also talked about reducing medical debt and defending Obamacare. Okay. The other thing that Harris has proposed is an expansion of Medicare home health care for the elderly and disabled to be paid for by the savings from drug benefits, okay? Neither one is focusing on major reforms of the healthcare system at this point. That may be good. There's a lot of other things to deal with. We seem to be getting along okay with what we got now, but there may be a problem. Next slide. Because Obamacare and ACA enrollments nearly doubled since the 2021 subsidy expansion under ARP. It added 9.5 million coverees due to the ARP expansions. Now, those are supposed to expire in 2025, and they're going to have to be renewed. If they're not renewed, ACA premium is going to go up. Costs are going to increase for low-income people beyond 7% of income. There'll be lower income limits. And the Congressional Budget Office estimates that 3.4 million fewer people will have insurance if the subsidies drop and prices rise. Okay. So this is part of this tax bill I'm going to talk about at the end. Now, whomever gets elected will claim credit for drug price reforms on insulin, Medicare spending limits, and cost reductions for key drugs like Eliquis, which us older people take, big reduction for this antiarrhythmic drug passed in the Biden administration. They'll take credit, whoever's there. Okay, On to the next one, entitlement time. Income support policies. The child tax credit, the child independent care tax credit, that's different, SNAP or food share, and Social Security. 3 of the largest federal income support policies are in play now right after the election. These are entitlements, okay? Trump and Harris both like the child tax credit, but with different aims. Harris wants to fight child poverty, so she wants to increase the number of people who get it at the bottom. Trump thinks it's a tax cut for people higher up in the income scale, and he wants to basically renew or maybe increase the cuts that were put in 2017, okay? So it's a $110 billion program now. Most of the benefits go to middle and high income families, and they deny benefits to the poorest quarter of children whose parents owe no income tax. This includes grandparents and grandfamilies and others taking care of kids, but they don't get any help. Harris would expand the tax cuts to the ACA levels and beyond for newborns as a large anti-poverty plan, including millions of parents with low pay or no jobs, creating an income guarantee, and making a landmark expansion of the safety net. So they both want it, but they want to help different ends of the distribution, as Mike mentioned, distributional policy. The Harris plan would increase the annual cost of the child tax credit by $100 billion or more, but it would reduce child poverty from its current level by 37%. And she would further continue to expand child care credits as in the child independent child care credit. So there's more credits that help lower income people in particular who can't afford market child care to go to work. Next. There's another labor supply concern. The CTC under the Harris plan would save if it was more targeted at the poor, if they got rid of the $400,000 people. But some worry that unconditional aid would weaken incentives to work. One unpublished study predicted 1.5 million parents would leave the workforce. Others predicted an impact at a quarter of that size or less. Several recent studies found no reductions in work during the 2021 ARP. Okay, now that wasn't permanent. The other ones would be more permanent. You also have to understand that the CTC differs from traditional cash aid. It's not counted against other programs. It helps reimburse you for the expensive cost of raising kids. It's not taxed and it's not counted against other programs. So poor parents keep it as their incomes grow. That may boost employment because it helps them afford childcare or car repairs and things like that. And the National Academy of Sciences study says including this child-dependent child tax credit and other child care subsidies with the CTC leads to more work. You get more work from the child care subsidies than jobs that were lost to the increase in the child tax credit. Okay, I'm winding up. 2 other programs, SNAP, food share. $30 billion in cuts in aid, no indexation of food plan for food inflation, added red tape, and so forth. That's come out of the House, okay? The Senate hasn't taken it up. So we don't have a farm bill yet because we can't agree on whether we're going to keep SNAP feeding people or we're going to cut it. Now, famously, Social Security is off the table for now. You remember Biden took it off the table. It's off the table pre-election. But it's going to start paying lower benefits in 10 years unless we raise taxes or cut future benefits. There's several things we can do. Acting now would increase confidence in the future of the program and in time reduce the growing federal deficit. Neither candidate will raise the issue now, but I'm telling you it's going to come up in 2025 or 2026. Next, last. The looming federal income tax bill. This is where the ACA subsidies, income support programs that I talked about, other tax laws affecting middle-income people will be competing with keeping lower corporate tax rates and keeping lower income tax for the top few percent of other elements of the 2017 Trump tax cut. Trump has initially proposed no new taxes on Social Security benefits, as Kim mentioned, no new taxes on overtime, no taxes on Americans living abroad. Where will Elon Musk take up residence, one wonders. Plus keeping all the TCJA tax cuts now on the books, including the current CTC. Harris, on the other hand, wants to increase taxes on the rich, get rid of those tax breaks for the rich, add tax breaks for first-time homebuyers, small business startups, and expanded CTC. The CFRB says both plans would increase the deficit, just as Kim showed you. So that's it for me. I'm sorry it took a little bit longer, but there's plenty to talk about. Thank you.
That was a tour de force. We covered a lot of things. We'll come back to some of them. I'm grateful to have you with us tonight, Tim, and thanks for making the effort. I know you've had some travel delays, and really appreciate you being here. We're going to go next to Mark Copelovitch. And Mark, we know that you've got a lot to say about international trade policies, international financial policies, the differences between the candidates and how that might be perceived in the rest of the world, and what the reaction functions might be for trading partners as well. So thanks for joining us, Mark.
Great. Thanks for having me. All right, so the advantage of going last is you heard what everybody said, and the disadvantage is some of what you were going to say has already been said. But I think what I will cover fits nicely in with Kim and Tim. And as the political scientist in the room, even though I study international trade and finance, I think I can also say something about the foreign policies and views on international cooperation of the candidate. So I'll talk about trade policy and pick up the themes on tariffs that Kim talked about. Talk about macroeconomic policy and debt and deficits. And there's a little preview here of what I'm going to say, and then talk about foreign policy as well. So next slide, please. So Kim already talked about tariffs, and one of the things we've seen now with both Trump and Biden over the last 8 years is we've moved from a world where from the 1960s onward, really, we had moved in the US and around the world toward more progressive trade liberalization and the removal of tariffs, that is taxes on imports, as a policy tool. And, you know, under Trump, we moved very much in the other direction. And one of the notable things about Joe Biden, for all his differences with Donald Trump, is he basically kept almost all of Donald Trump's trade policies in place. So if you can actually go ahead to the next slide, and then I'll come back here in a second. So when we're talking about tariffs, this is from a CNN article from yesterday, where there's a lot of debate. Trump will tell you that other people will pay for tariffs, but we know as good social scientists, it's not other countries paying, it's Americans who are paying. Right? And when we think about tariffs, you can see from the panel on the left, it is American companies importing goods that are paying those tariffs. And then the question is whether they are eating those costs, or in most cases, they are passing them on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And what we saw with the trade war with China and the steel and aluminum tariffs under Trump was quite a lot of tariffs on about 15% of US imports. But what Trump is now calling for is blanket tariffs of 20% on all trade, on all goods that come into the United States. And so you can see that from the panel on the right. That is a massive change in American trade policy, functional reversal of decades of trade policy. We've seen it in the United States. You can go back to the previous slide. So what that will mean, as Tim was talking about, immigration policy and deportations will be a huge shock to the economy, causing labor shortages and wages and costs to go up. A full-on trade war with 20% blanket tariffs is something in conjunction with the immigration policy that could cause a huge recession in the United States. And, you know, the way both Trump and Biden talk about tariffs, the US politics is sort of lost in the 1960s, where we think about, you know, the average voter is someone who works in manufacturing, and tariffs protect jobs in the manufacturing industry. Given the way the global economy has evolved and the US economy has evolved in the last 60 years, the average voter now is someone who works in the non-tradable services sector, right? You can think of someone who is a nurse or a teacher or works in retail. Those people experience trade only as consumers, right? And so often when you ask Americans, do you want to protect jobs through tariffs? People will say yes, and that is somewhat popular. People also have shown with their economic behavior over many decades that they like cheap imports. People like to buy things at Walmart, Target, and on Amazon, almost all of which are imported. And so Trump's tariffs would be a functional equivalent of a 20% tax on almost everything that we buy as consumers. And so there's a huge economic hit to that. There also is a question about what is the strategy of Trump's trade policy. Right? This would be a blanket policy. In the previous administration, the logic was we're targeting China. The US has a big trade deficit with China, and that may or may not help that trade deficit. This would be a blanket policy with no clear discernible strategy or end game. right? So I think of those as spinal tap tariffs, and that we're taking the tariffs of the first Trump administration and we'd be turning them up to 11, right? And possibly triggering a major global trade war. Now, with a Harris administration, Harris in general, I think, is less protectionist than Joe Biden. Joe Biden is very much a product of his generation. He grew up in Pennsylvania, near where I grew up, in kind of coal and steel and manufacturing country. And I think very much has that idea that tariffs are good for protecting jobs and protecting manufacturing in the United States. I don't know that Harris shares quite as much of that view of the world and his protectionism. But one thing that Biden did do is he left all of the Trump tariffs in place on China. And also, the Biden administration basically stopped decades of US involvement with international trade institutions. The US has been blocking judges on the court in the World Trade Organization. We basically have stopped negotiating what are known as preferential trade agreements. These are regional trade agreements like NAFTA. And so the momentum on that is driven now by the European Union. So Harris is not a free trader. I think she's less protectionist than Biden. I think she may be more focused on consumers, and given her ties to Silicon Valley and California, maybe more focused on American companies that depend on trade because of global value chains for imports into manufacturing. So I think she would be less protectionist than Biden, certainly less protectionist than Trump. A lot of it depends on personnel, right? Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, and his U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, are very protectionist and view trade in a very zero-sum way as a battle with China. So it would depend in some ways on who replaces those leading characters in what would be a Harris administration. Next slide, please. One more. Great. So let me talk a little bit about macroeconomic policy, by which I mean monetary policy and fiscal policy. So Kim talked a lot about deficits and the sort of mechanisms and deficits. And I think one of the things he highlights, which I, as a political scientist who work on this think about, is that there's a lot of evidence over the last several decades now that both parties love to talk about the debt and the deficit and hit each other over the head as the other party not caring about the deficit. But in their revealed behavior, neither party really cares about the deficit, right? Tim talked about this. Trump wants to renew all of the 2017 tax cuts. So another big round of budget busting tax cuts. And Harris, like Biden, has basically said, well, we don't want to go that far, but basically anybody who earns less than $400,000 a year is not going to have higher taxes. So both parties have in many ways decided that we can't have any more revenue from somewhere between 95 to 100% of the population. And you might think that that would be politically unpopular, right? If you can flip to the next slide, and then I'll come back. In some ways, everybody says that they care about the debt, but we've been talking for almost as long as I've been alive about our unsustainable debt. Democrats were talking about it in the 1980s as being a big problem. Bob Dole was talking about it in the 1990s as being a big problem. Paul Ryan was talking about it in the 2000s. The debt to GDP ratio keeps going up because, as Kim pointed out, we are running as a country, right? We are spending more than we are bringing in tax revenue, and we're covering that by borrowing. You can go back one more slide. So the way I look at it as a political scientist is voters have a revealed preference, right, via their electoral behavior, that if voters really cared about debt and deficits and thought it was a problem, they would elect different politicians and they would punish politicians who run up the debt. And they haven't really done that, right? And I'll come back to that in a second, that everyone says they love debt reduction in the abstract, but they hate it in details. The other thing on macroeconomic policy that I would say is I think the one big main point of disagreement is Trump and J.D. Vance have talked a lot about cutting back on the independence of the Federal Reserve and politicizing interest rate policy. And Vance in particular has talked about affecting the level of the dollar exchange rate to try and make American exports cheaper and kickstart the economy that way. And those are both things that both parties for most of the last 40 or 50 years have really thought about third rails, where you're not gonna touch the Federal Reserve as an independent agency, and you're gonna have a strong dollar, but not try and manipulate the exchange rate. I think we might see big changes on that in the Trump administration, where you might try and weaponize monetary policy against our trading partners like the EU and China in a way that we haven't seen for a very long time. You can go forward 2 slides, please. So this is just a little bit of polling data to give you a sense of why, from the political science perspective, I think that voters in both parties, when they say they care about the debt, they don't really mean it. So if you ask people on the left here, there's some Pew polling data from 2023 and 2019. If you ask people whether they want to reduce the budget deficit or whether the debt is a problem, a majority will tell you yes, a sort of modest majority in the 50s or so. But when you then ask people, what would you like to cut? Right? The answer is there's not a majority for anything. So if you look on the right here, this is a Pew survey from 2019, and you can go down the list: education, infrastructure, entitlements, foreign aid, military defense, assistance to the unemployed, healthcare, all of these things. There isn't a majority for cutting any of these things. And in fact, there are very large majorities for keeping the same spending or increasing spending on almost all of these things. And so I think about that way that, most voters are symbolically fiscal hawks, but operationally, they don't really care about the debt, right? People like the government to do things. Most people want the government to do more things. And if you think about the majority in a divided Congress that would agree on what we could cut to substantially reduce the deficit or the debt, the answer right now and going forward, I think, is almost nothing. And over the last many years, it has been almost nothing, which is why the debt keeps rising. Next slide, please. Now, I have maybe a different perspective than Kim does. I study international finance, and I'm working on a book right now on the dominance of the dollar in global finance. We issue the world's dominant reserve currency. Basically, the global economy runs on dollars, and everybody wants to hold dollars. And whether or not we think debt and deficits and more borrowing is a good idea, the reality is that the US is able to get away with it more than any other country in the world. Right? So we saw some charts where debt to GDP is about 100 to 120% now. That seems really high. It is historically high by American standards. But there are countries like Japan that borrow in rates as low as the US does, that has a debt to GDP twice that, and they don't issue the dollar. So I think what will happen is the financial dominance of the US and the global financial system basically allows us the luxury of talking about the debt, but not really doing anything serious about it. And I would expect that to continue regardless of who is elected president. I think the numbers we saw before are on target, and the debt and deficits would increase substantially more under Trump, but I think they will also increase under Harris. Next slide, please. All right, so let me finish just saying a little bit about foreign policy and international cooperation. And I think this is actually the single biggest difference between the two parties and the two candidates right now. Donald Trump has a very different view of the Ukraine war, the values of NATO as our core military alliance, our allies. You see him constantly talking about our NATO allies are not spending enough on defense. He talked about whether we would withdraw from NATO. He doesn't really believe in the value of international cooperation and international institutions. And when he does talk about it, it's in a very transactional sense, right? Which is different from the way both parties historically have thought about. The US is the post-World War II founder of what we call the liberal international order, and that we are basically the bedrock of things like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, NATO, the World Trade Organization. I think a Trump administration is going to go further down the line of withdrawing the US from playing that leading role in international cooperation. And I think the starkest place you would see that is on how much aid we would keep providing to Ukraine. Would there be pressure to accede to some of Russia's demands? I think a lot of that will depend on who controls Congress. If the Democrats control Congress, there'll be strong pushing back on that. But I think that, the future of Ukraine and NATO is very uncertain. I think Kamala Harris would continue Biden's policies more or less, but those are very different policies. And Mike asked me to comment a little on how our allies are thinking about this. I was on sabbatical in Berlin last year, and I spent some time talking to officials in the German government. And the consistent message I got from people in the German economics and finance ministry and the German parliament was they are very much worried about the US withdrawing from international cooperation and from Europe under a Trump administration. But also it's not the first rodeo now. And they are planning how can they work issue by issue, both together within the European Union and with people in various ministries like State and the Treasury Department and the Defense Department, maybe to break things down and keep transatlantic cooperation going, even though the White House executive level relations might be frostier. So I think that's one big thing that the Europeans are very concerned about being left on their own against Russia to deal with Ukraine. But they are thinking about how can we, as they did in the last Trump administration, maintain ties with the U.S. At a more lower level, government level, at the ministry level. And then the other big thing is how would the two parties react to China? And there's a lot of talk these days about, are we in a new Cold War with China? Are we in a trade war with China? With Harris, again, I think a lot depends on personnel. A lot of the Biden administration's economic policies have been geared towards we are in an inevitable strategic rivalry over the next decades with China for global economic and military hegemony. That's very much Jake Sullivan's view, again, at the National Security Council. So Harris might continue that, but a lot would depend who would be her foreign and economic policy team. And with Trump, I think much of it could be, again, saber rattling with China and the kind of zero-sum rivalry that we saw in the first Trump administration. But on the other hand, right now, the U.S. economy is doing incredibly well. And the Chinese economy, which was doing well 7 or 8 years ago, is actually doing quite badly right now. So I could also imagine U.S.-China relations under a Trump administration being a little rosier, because you could imagine Trump coming in and saying, the tariffs worked. Look how good the U.S. economic recovery is, even though the tariffs weren't really what caused the U.S. economic recovery. Basically claiming victory and therefore feeling like he could be a little bit more cooperative with China because they are not doing as well. I think the big X factor is what would happen with Taiwan, right? If China really made signs towards invading Taiwan, then I think all bets are off with both the Trump or Harris administration. And we're in a very different world where maybe cooperation with our European allies is something Trump would want to do because he'd be concerned about the US-China rivalry and the military conflict. So that's just a little bit on the foreign policy side to go with the economic policy side. But I think you would see very different policies, both on trade and fiscal policy, but even starker differences between the two administrations when it came to foreign policy and international cooperation.
Thank you, Mark. Wow. Well, what a tour de force, as was noted in the comments by Steve Goldstein. I think all of you gave, very interesting perspective on a number of issues. One of the things that came through tonight is that, tariffs are something that really the president kind of does control. And I'd like to go a little deeper into tariffs. We do talk about the notion that, well, maybe tariffs get passed through the consumer. Lisa Stoltz noted, well, okay, then they do, but then wouldn't that mean you would buy domestic instead of buying foreign? And so maybe that's good for the economy. And Jeff Johnson, noted that maybe that is the purpose of this. We're trying to shift jobs domestically. But of course, we haven't talked about the reaction function of what are the trading partners going to do, or trading, some cases adversaries. But, what's the problem with, raising tariffs and touching off a trade war? And maybe I'll start with Kim to just kind of walk me through, how do you think about that issue? Because I think, a lot of the things we buy from abroad, there aren't actually domestic substitutes anymore. Like we started buying brooms from other countries, and we don't make a lot of brooms anymore. So that's going to get passed through. And maybe the broom industry comes back, or maybe not. I don't know. But Kim, Mark, Tim, tell me more about tariffs, and where do you see that going?
It's simple. It's a sales tax. So I'm selling bananas. I'm importing bananas from Mexico, and they're $1. And you're growing bananas in the United States, and your costs are a little higher. Suddenly they're $1.20. What are you going to sell your bananas at? $1.19. That's what you're going to do. So you're going to make some money, or you're going to expand. It's protecting your industry. That's one thing, right? Now, if there's retaliation and so forth, your exports are going to go down. You're not going to be able to export your bananas out of the country that you were doing some exports to. So you're going to get hurt there again. It doesn't really help. I'll stop there and let Kim or Mark say more.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tariffs we saw in the first Trump administration and under the Biden administration, Mike, are very much in that we are trying to bring certain industries like solar, right, and clean energy manufacturing back to the United States, or we're trying to protect jobs. But if you're talking about these blanket 20% tariffs, then you have exactly the problem you said, which is, we don't make consumer electronics and textiles and all of these things in the quantity that we used to. In some cases, we don't make them at all. So all you're doing is raising the prices on consumers, because there aren't actually domestic substitutes, and you're not going to have domestic substitutes. They're expensive to produce here because the wages American makes are much more expensive, and that's the reason those things are produced overseas.
If I could just chime in real quick too, a lot of the things we import are inputs into our own firms, into American manufacturers and American businesses. So it's not just, the consumer pays a little bit more for lettuce because it's coming from abroad. It's that car makers are paying more for steel. Beer manufacturers are paying more for aluminum to make cans out of. Construction is more expensive. The things that we want to do in the country are getting more expensive. And from the last rounds of tariffs, the data definitely showed that most of those tariffs are getting passed on to higher prices in the U.S. For the reasons Tim talked about, and for the reason that there just aren't anybody to compete with in the U.S. I think that's a lot of kind of what we're seeing. We're seeing there's blanket tariffs, but the Biden administration just added a bunch of new tariffs 3 weeks ago or so, and those were on things like solar panels, batteries for electric vehicles, some sorts of minerals. And then the last thing is just there's very little evidence that we can create jobs in any meaningful way by raising tariffs. It's just
Right.
You can create you can find somebody who sells a bit more, maybe even a plant that reopened, but we're paying dearly for adding a few more jobs. It's just there's really not much there to.
And that's
And I said earlier, there's a lost in the 1960s quality to this. I think Tim hit on it. There's global value chains now, and firms are both importers of inputs and producing exports, and that's where most of the job growth is in the United States. So there's a lot of firms that are pro-trade, and that have spent a lot of time over the last 8 years now lobbying for acceptance from all the tariff. The old school, steel producers from where I grew up in Pennsylvania, circa 1980s, that's a very small share of jobs and employment now. And so, again, these are politically popular because you can get up as a presidential candidate and say, I'm going to do something about China. But then when people really realize what that's going to mean for their pocketbooks, it's going to be deeply unpopular with folks.
Yeah, it's just so hard for people to trace it back to the cause, at that. But I mean, at a very high level, we are rolling back what was the gradual assertion of comparative advantage across the globe, where production of goods was occurring at the most efficient location. The net result of that is the United States built the most dominant high technology sector in the world. And that is actually the key to American political, economic, and military dominance today. And we're going to roll all that back because, it sounds good. But, I'm really worried about the effects of that. And that's a difficult thing. I was going to ask a bit more about deficits, but Mark, you gave us, I think, a pretty good summary about the allure of that, and Kim laid out a very good framework on that. So I'm not going to dive in there. Let me go to immigration for a minute. And one question I've always had is, why doesn't the United States recruit immigrants the way the Badgers recruit football players? We are in a pitched battle in the world today.
Yeah.
Or, let's just say power. I mean, I don't want to be looking up at autocratic countries. And so why aren't we more strategic and less passive about that issue? And, is there something I'm missing? I mean, is that morally bankrupt or what?
No, we're trying it a little bit, Mike. We've people who are going to work in the semiconductor industry. They've opened up more visas for people to stay here and do that, because that's an industry that's key to us. We really want to be able to produce our own semiconductors so we don't have to rely on China or others. And there's extra visas for high-end people there. Okay. But we don't have enough high-end visas that companies want to keep people. And we have a lot of people who come here and get educated and want to stay here in the country, but have to leave because they lose their visa. We should change that. That's for sure. But that's not the main problem we have now. Is an awful lot of less skilled people who are trying to make a living here, who are deep into major industries, including dairy and home building and home care. And if we just take that 6.5 million of them out, or take 10 million of them out, prices are going to get bid up. There's going to be a huge fight for workers. Maybe some retirees will continue to work a little longer. Not me, but maybe some others. But I'm telling you, you're going to have wage price spiral here. There's something you just don't want to take these people out. They're very important to the economy. Businessmen don't want them to go out. Politicians, of course, do. But
the short answer to the question, Mike, is politicians are scared, and you see this in every Western democracy right now, of the identity-based backlash to immigration. Right, so you can make the economic case you're laying out and that Tim's describing, like, is all ironclad basically. But politicians are scared because you have, over the last 20 years in the U.S. and in Europe and Brazil and elsewhere, the rise of populist far-right nationalist parties whose main pillar, right, is there are too many immigrants in our country and it's threatening national identity. You see it in Germany with the AfD. It was the decisive thing with the Brexit vote in the UK in 2016. You see it in the US, you see it in other places. And so I think most politicians are scared to make, nobody is making the full-throated case for trade that you made a few minutes ago. And nobody is making the full-throated case for more immigration. But if you really, in economic terms, wanted to say, like, what are the pillars that have made the US economically strong over the last 150 years? It's basically those two things, right?
They're certainly key. They're a part of it. Not to mention our dominance in the most important industry, higher education.
Yes.
Which certainly feeds our technological dominance. I mean, we attract the best and brightest from around the world because we have the best universities on the planet. And a lot of those people stay and have a huge impact on our economy. And we need to be thinking a lot more about how do we fortify that sector, because that is really the bedrock of U.S. influence in the world and will be for years to come. But we are at the top of the hour. Kim, it's already 9:00 in Rochester. You probably got to get to bed. Tim's got to get to a hotel finally.
7:00.
Landed in the lounge. And Mark and I are just here in Madison living our best lives. But thank you guys for joining us tonight. Really insightful analysis of many of these policies. I wish it wasn't such a polarized country and we had more thoughtful discussion about economic growth instead of what seems to be a lot of things aimed at redistribution and feel-good stuff that sounds good and maybe isn't going to deliver quite what people imagine. But great to have you all here. We'll reconvene again, I'm sure, at some point, and just really appreciate the time you spent tonight.
Thanks for having us, Mike.
Thanks for having us. Great.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
So we'll be back again next month with another program, topic yet to be determined, but there will be plenty to talk about in November, I'm sure. Maybe the policies of a new administration, and we might convene some of this group again. But Thanks for joining us tonight. A lot of thoughtful questions in the chat. We didn't have a lot of time to get to all of them, but really appreciate everybody joining us this evening, and on Wisconsin.